Barry Goldwater, a five-term US Senator, once said, "Those who seek absolute power, even though they seek it to do what they regard as good, are simply demanding the right to enforce their own version of heaven on earth. And let me remind you, they are the very ones who always create the most hellish tyrannies. Absolute power does corrupt, and those who seek it must be suspect and must be opposed." Long before politics, my concern has always been with the disadvantaged South Australians, the Aussie battlers who deserve a fair go, the mums, the dads and the grandparents on whose back this state depended on until, of course, they were struck down by misfortune. My work was in the area of drug treatment and rehabilitation prior to politics, and what I've seen over the past 4 years of political life makes me sick to my stomach. I'm frustrated because I know that if it were not for poor social policies and a refocus on priorities, the problems we face as a community could and would be fixed. My resume does not consist of law degrees, an economic degree, or a degree of any kind at all. My qualifications come from the University of Life, coming from a working class family and being raised in a housing trust area all my life. I can remember better times when governments were solution-based and when it seemed that constituents were seen as more than votes in a ballot box every 4 years, and when it was recognised that there was a mandate for government to care for and to care about the people they were paid to serve. All that has changed, and now we have a system based on deceit through political spin, point scoring against the purpose and opposite, and political game playing rather than on finding solutions for the day-to-day business of this state. Last year we saw changes made to legislation that would further put injured workers under the hammer. Mark Parnell and I tried to run a filibuster in Parliament to try and buy time for the unions to take this issue to the National Conference and force Mike Rann and his government to rethink. We did not succeed, not because we did not have enough material to continue the debate for weeks if necessary, but because both the Liberals and Labor parties joined together to push that legislation through, accepting no amendments and both on a timeline with big business. We all knew that the legislation was not going to make the experiences of injured workers any easier to deal with. We all knew that the new legislation was not going to go anywhere near reining in the conduct of WorkCover or the claims agents. And we also knew that unless there was a dramatic change in the processes of assessment and return to work initiatives, that the unfunded liability would continue to rise. We all knew all of this, and yet, in my mind, the effort to put into taking the government to task lacked any true commitment at all. It was such an important debate, yet it almost seemed like an inconvenience to many to have to be present for that debate itself. We all understand that governing the state and getting balance right would indeed be a difficult job, but we should also consider that if a party is not capable of doing the job, then it simply should not be in government. The other side of that, of course, is the job of opposition to loyally oppose bad legislation and to put forward amendments that would be acceptable to the majority of members. What did we see instead? We saw the opposition and the government join forces and force the passage of bad legislation that favoured business over the basic needs of injured workers. It was indeed a sad day for all South Australians to see a government sell out injured workers and their families, and to see the opposition of the state failing to loyally oppose legislation that would compromise the rights of injured workers to their legal entitlements. If we look at all the players in the issue of WorkCover and identify their roles and responsibilities, and then develop and implement legislation to ensure that all players are bound to lawful conduct and lawful process, we would not have the situation we have now of injured workers and their families struggling to keep a roof over their head, feed their families, and live a relatively comfortable life in this lucky country. But there seems to be this mindset that injured workers are bludgers who do not want to return to work. Where did that perception originate from? I believed it originated from a propaganda campaign called Dogging a Cheat. A perception was created there and then that injured workers are bludgers who just do not want to go back to work. This was done even when research showed that less than 1% of injured workers were cheating the system. But time and energy and resources were spent to create a reality that this 1% was in actual fact the majority. This then over time allowed legislation to be changed, to be made tougher on injured workers. Imagine if workplace audits were done and any employer found to be in breach of health and safety standards were fined, and those reports were kept as a matter of course to reflect upon when workplace injuries occurred and to be taken into consideration in the assessment process. Imagine if an injured worker was able to go to a specialist in the field of his or her injury, be examined and assessed, and have that assessment become evidence of the treatment regime required, the rehabilitation approach needed, and then eventually training to return to work, and the corporation claims agents were bound to fulfil those needs. Imagine if WorkCover did not have the unlimited financial means to settle all matters of payouts by fighting injured workers in a tribunal that has been known to take direction from the very statutory authority it is there to oversee. Imagine if government were to bring in legislation that was designed to prescribe the conduct of all parties and was prepared to cut off the heads of those found to be in breach of their lawful responsibilities. Imagine if we had both government and opposition hold fast to the belief that a person has the right to return home from work in the same condition as they left their home to go to work. Indeed, we would have a system that would be at least near functional, rather than what we have now. Social and natural justice are the rights of every person who lives in this state and this country, and are two concepts that seem to be fading fast in these days of economic rationalism. Social justice and natural justice can only exist when ministers of the Crown take full responsibility for their portfolios and are prepared to take their public servants and CEOs to task when it is apparent that misconduct is occurring. Rather, we have ministers of the Crown actually prepared to amend legislation to make legal what is illegal, such as the Form 5 fraud. All parties to proceedings in the Workers' Compensation Tribunal are supposed to be bound by the rules of that tribunal. However, from evidence that has been presented to my office, it would seem that all parties does not include WorkCover Corporation, who are seemingly able to comply or not, depending on what is in their best interest on a case-by-case basis. One such example of WorkCover deliberately breaching the tribunal rules for their own benefit is the use of redemption agreements drafted by their lawyers and full of jargon and loopholes instead of redemption pro forma, known as Form 5, required by the rules of the tribunal. Tellingly, WorkCover's own redemption agreements include privacy and confidentiality provisions, whereas Form 5 does not. WorkCover's own redemption agreements also lets WorkCover off the hook from having to ensure that injured workers are fully informed of their rights and the implications of a redemption agreement. But it is not only WorkCover that is responsible here, because the tribunal should have been ensuring that all parties, including WorkCover, complied with the tribunal's own rules. Instead, the tribunal appears to have been complicit by their silence for nearly a decade, after which time they amended the rules to match WorkCover's practice. We know that this matter is down to one injured worker among you, who, simply because I have not got permission, I won't name, but who I express my admiration for the fight he has waged to restore his rightful entitlements, and my hope is that he will ultimately be successful.